"Why don't you eat in the kitchen, Margaret? It'll be more comfortable for you there." Ashley said it with a smile so polished it could have passed for kindness, but the words landed cold, sharp, and deliberate, right there in the middle of Christmas morning, right there in the house I had once called my own. I remember the way the sunlight filtered through the living room windows, catching on the ornaments I had carefully wrapped and saved for years, the same ones my late husband used to hang with me every December, each piece holding a memory, each one placed with intention, and yet somehow, none of that seemed to matter anymore. I stood there for a moment, holding a tray of freshly baked cinnamon rolls, the warmth still rising from them, the smell of butter and sugar filling the air, and for just a second, I wondered if I had misheard her, if maybe I had misunderstood, because surely no one says something like that on Christmas morning, not to family, not to someone who had spent decades building the very traditions they were now enjoying without her. But then I saw the way Daniel avoided my eyes, the way he suddenly became very interested in adjusting the volume on the television, and that was all the confirmation I needed. I smiled, not because I felt like smiling, but because sometimes silence says more than any argument ever could. I nodded slightly, as if she had made a reasonable suggestion, as if it were the most natural thing in the world for a mother to be asked to step aside in her own son's home on a day that was supposed to be about togetherness. "Of course," I said softly, my voice steady, controlled, almost gentle, and I turned toward the kitchen before anyone could see the flicker of something colder settling behind my eyes. The kitchen felt smaller than I remembered, quieter too, like a place meant for preparation, not for celebration, and I set the tray down carefully on the counter, lining up the plates just as I had always done, habit guiding my hands even as my thoughts began to shift, slowly, deliberately, piece by piece. From where I stood, I could hear the laughter drifting in from the dining room, the clinking of glasses, the easy conversations that once included me without question, and I realized then that this hadn't just happened today, not suddenly, not without warning. No, this had been building for a long time, in small moments I had dismissed, in changes I had chosen not to see. I dried my hands on a towel and leaned slightly toward the doorway, just enough to catch a glimpse of the table, and that was when I noticed it. Place cards, neatly arranged, each one written in Ashley's careful handwriting, each seat assigned with intention. Daniel's name, Ashley's name, the kids, even distant relatives who barely visited. But not mine. My place, it seemed, had never been meant to exist. I stepped back into the kitchen before anyone could notice me looking, my heart steady, my breathing even, because by then, something inside me had already begun to settle into a kind of clarity I hadn't felt in a long time. I moved quietly, pouring coffee into a mug, the ceramic warm against my hands, and I told myself that I would not make a scene, not today, not ever again. I had spent too many years keeping the peace, smoothing over discomfort, convincing myself that family meant accepting things that didn't feel right. But standing there, separated by nothing more than a doorway, and yet feeling miles away, I understood something I should have seen much sooner. This wasn't about a seat at the table. It was about being removed from it entirely. And the most surprising part wasn't the hurt, not anymore. It was the calm that followed. I took a slow sip of coffee and let the quiet wrap around me, listening to the distant laughter as if it belonged to another life. And in that moment, I stopped waiting for things to go back to the way they were. Because deep down, I knew they never would. And for the first time, that didn't scare me. It clarified everything. I stood there a little longer than necessary, holding that mug as if it were something solid I could rely on, something predictable in a room that no longer felt familiar, and I let my eyes travel slowly across the kitchen, taking in the details I had once known by heart, the chipped corner of the counter near the sink, the cabinet door that never quite closed unless you pushed it twice, the small clock above the stove that I had bought 15 years ago during a clearance sale after Christmas, back when Daniel still called to ask me which decorations to put up and where to hang them. Back when I still believed that traditions were something that stayed, something that anchored a family in place. I could hear Ashley's voice drifting in again, light and confident, the kind of tone that fills a room effortlessly, and she was telling a story about a trip they had taken the previous summer, something about a beach house, something about how perfect everything had been, and I realized then that I had not even known they had gone anywhere. No one had mentioned it. No one had thought to tell me. I took another sip of coffee, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue, and I wondered how many other moments had passed without me noticing, how many quiet decisions had been made where my name simply was not included anymore. It had not always been like this. After my husband passed away 3 years ago, everything had felt uncertain at first, fragile in a way I had never experienced before. But Daniel had been attentive then, calling every evening, asking if I had eaten, if I needed anything, and Ashley had been polite, even warm at times, offering to help with groceries or inviting me over for dinner on Sundays. I had believed that was the beginning of something new, a different kind of closeness, not the same as before, but still meaningful, still rooted in care. And perhaps that had been true for a while. Or perhaps I had only seen what I wanted to see. I set the mug down gently and reached for a plate, placing 2 cinnamon rolls on it out of habit, even though I was not hungry, even though the idea of eating felt distant and unnecessary. From the other room, I heard Daniel laugh, a full, easy sound that I had not heard directed toward me in quite some time. And there was a pause, followed by Ashley saying something softer, something I could not quite catch, and then another ripple of laughter, and I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were listening to strangers rather than my own family. I moved toward the doorway again, slower this time, more deliberate, and I leaned just enough to see the table clearly. The children were sitting neatly, their small hands wrapped around glasses of orange juice, their attention focused entirely on Ashley as she spoke, and Daniel sat beside her, relaxed, comfortable, exactly where he belonged. It struck me then, not as a sudden realization, but as something that had been forming quietly beneath the surface, that this arrangement had been decided long before today. The seating, the place cards, the way Ashley directed everything without hesitation, it was not improvised. It was practiced. It was established, and I had simply not been part of it. I stepped back again, careful not to let the floor creak beneath me, and I returned to the counter, placing the plate down untouched, my movements calm, measured, almost mechanical, because reacting now would change nothing, and I had spent too many years reacting, adjusting, making room for others without ever asking what space was left for me. Instead, I began to think, not in a rushed or emotional way, but slowly, methodically, the way my husband used to approach a problem when something in the house needed fixing. He would stand back, observe, consider every angle before touching a single tool, and I found myself doing the same now, looking at this situation not as a moment of hurt, but as a pattern that had finally become visible. The missing place card, the kitchen suggestion, the stories I had never heard, the invitations that had quietly stopped coming, each piece fitting together with a clarity that was almost unsettling in its simplicity. I walked to the small drawer beside the sink and opened it, not because I needed anything from it, but because it gave me a reason to stand still, to gather my thoughts without drawing attention. And inside were the usual things, rubber bands, spare keys, folded takeout menus. Nothing remarkable, nothing important, and yet I could not shake the feeling that everything important had already been moved elsewhere, out of reach, out of sight, out of my hands. I closed the drawer gently and rested my palm against the cool surface of the counter, grounding myself in the present, and I realized then that what I had assumed was temporary, a phase, a period of adjustment after loss, had in fact become something permanent. Not just distance, but replacement. A quiet, careful replacement that had happened so gradually I had almost missed it entirely. I took a slow breath and straightened my shoulders, not out of defiance, not yet, but out of understanding, because once you see something clearly, you cannot return to the comfort of not knowing. And in that moment, standing alone in the kitchen on a morning that was meant to bring people together, I understood exactly where I stood. Not at the table, not in the center, but just outside of it, close enough to hear, far enough to be forgotten. And for the first time, I did not try to change that. I simply accepted it, quietly, completely, and began to consider what that acceptance would require of me next. I remained in the kitchen longer than anyone would have expected, not because I needed to be there, but because it gave me time to observe without being observed. And there is a certain kind of clarity that comes when people forget you are still within earshot, when they assume you have accepted your place and stopped paying attention. The voices from the dining room shifted slightly as plates were passed around and chairs moved, the rhythm of the morning continuing without interruption. And then I heard Ashley again, her tone lower this time, more casual, The kind of voice people use when they believe they are speaking privately even when they are not. She mentioned something about rearranging the house in the coming months, about needing more space, about making things more practical, and I felt a small, almost imperceptible tightening in my chest, not from fear, but from recognition. Daniel responded with a quiet agreement, something brief, something non-committal on the surface, but enough to confirm that this was not a new conversation between them. This had been discussed before. Planned, even. I moved a step closer to the doorway, just enough to catch a clearer line of sight, and that was when I noticed the envelope on the sideboard near the dining table. It was partially tucked beneath a stack of holiday cards, but the edge was visible, thick, official, the kind of paper that carries weight without needing explanation. My name was printed on it, but it had not been given to me. It had been set aside, forgotten, perhaps, or deliberately ignored. I watched as Ashley reached over and adjusted the cards, her fingers brushing the envelope without hesitation, as if it belonged exactly where it was, as if it were already part of something she controlled. No one mentioned it. No one acknowledged it. The conversation continued, moving on to plans for the new year, travel ideas, renovations, small details that painted a picture I had not been invited to see until now. I stepped back again, slowly, carefully, letting the image settle in my mind, because sometimes the smallest details reveal the largest truths. I turned toward the sink and ran the water lightly, not because I needed to wash anything, but because the sound created a barrier, a soft cover for my thoughts as they began to organize themselves with a precision that surprised even me. For years, I had trusted that certain things were secure, that certain decisions had already been made in my favor, quietly, responsibly, with care. My husband had always been thorough. He had believed in structure, in planning ahead, in making sure that everything we built would remain protected long after he was gone. I remembered the way he used to sit at the dining table late at night, papers spread out in front of him, explaining in careful terms how everything was arranged, how nothing would be left uncertain, how I would always have control over what we had worked so hard to create. And yet, standing there now, listening to a conversation that treated those same things as flexible, as adjustable, as something to be redistributed without my involvement, I realized that control is only meaningful if you continue to hold it. I turned off the water and dried my hands slowly, deliberately, each movement measured, because there was no urgency in what I needed to do next, only certainty. I glanced once more toward the dining room, just in time to see Ashley pick up the envelope and slide it neatly into a folder that sat beside her chair, her movements smooth, practiced, unremarkable to anyone who was not paying attention. Daniel did not react. He did not question it. He simply continued eating, nodding occasionally, participating in a life that had quietly moved forward without me. I felt no anger in that moment, no sudden rush of emotion, only a steady awareness that something important had been shifted out of place, and that I had been expected not to notice. I walked over to the small table by the window where I had placed my coat earlier that morning, the fabric still cool to the touch, and I rested my hand on it briefly, grounding myself once again in the reality of the present. Outside, the light had grown brighter, reflecting off the thin layer of snow that covered the yard, everything appearing calm, untouched, almost peaceful in a way that felt disconnected from what was unfolding inside. I took a slow breath and let it out quietly, allowing the silence of the kitchen to settle around me, because I understood now that whatever came next would not be decided in the dining room, not through conversation or confrontation, but through action taken carefully, quietly, and at the right moment. I had spent enough time reacting to what others chose for me. It was time to consider what I would choose for myself. And as I stood there, alone but no longer uncertain, I realized that the envelope, the conversation, the absence of my place at the table, they were not separate incidents. They were connected. They were part of a larger design that had been unfolding gradually, patiently, right in front of me. And now that I could see it clearly, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. I did not move right away, not because I was unsure, but because timing has a way of shaping outcomes more than intention ever could, and I had learned that lesson long before this morning, back when my husband would remind me that patience is not weakness, it is preparation. I slipped my coat over my shoulders slowly, the fabric settling into place as if it had been waiting for this moment, and I picked up my purse from the small table by the window. feeling the familiar weight of it in my hand, grounding, steady, unchanged even as everything else seemed to shift around me. From the dining room, the conversation continued without pause, the same easy rhythm, the same light laughter, and it struck me then that not once had anyone called out to ask where I was. Not once had anyone wondered if I might join them, and that absence of concern told me more than any harsh words ever could. I stepped quietly toward the hallway, my footsteps measured, careful not to draw attention, and I paused just long enough to glance once more toward the dining room, not out of longing, but out of acknowledgement, because there was a time when that table had been mine to set, mine to fill, mine to gather people around, and now it belonged to someone else entirely. Ashley sat at the head of the table, her posture relaxed, confident, her hand resting lightly near the folder that now held the envelope with my name on it, and Daniel sat beside her, close enough to be part of that center, far enough for me to make his silence feel intentional. I did not look for sympathy in his face anymore. I already knew I would not find it. I turned away without hesitation and walked down the hallway toward the study, a room that had remained mostly untouched since my husband passed, a space filled with quiet order, with the faint scent of old paper and polished wood, a place where decisions had once been made carefully, deliberately, without haste. The door opened easily, and I stepped inside, closing it gently behind me, letting the quiet settle around me like a familiar presence. The desk was exactly as I remembered it, papers aligned, drawers closed, everything in its place, and for a moment I allowed myself to stand there, not out of sentiment, but out of respect for what this room represented. Then I moved forward and opened the top drawer, my hands steady, my movements precise, and inside were the documents I had expected to find, the ones my husband had walked me through more than once, explaining each detail with the kind of clarity that leaves no room for misunderstanding. The trust papers, the property deed, the account authorizations. Everything still intact, everything still under my control, at least for now. I lifted the folder carefully, feeling its weight, not just in paper but in meaning, and I understood then why that envelope had been set aside in the other room, why Ashley had kept it close but not opened it in front of me. They were waiting for the right moment, the right conversation, the right circumstance where I might be persuaded, gently or otherwise, to sign something, to agree to something, to step aside in a way that would make their plans easier to execute. But plans only work when all variables are accounted for, and I realized with a quiet certainty that I was the variable they had underestimated. I closed the drawer and held the folder close for a moment, not out of attachment, but out of decision, because once a choice is made clearly, there is no need to revisit it. I placed the documents carefully into my purse, ensuring they were secure, concealed, exactly where they needed to be, and then I looked around the room one last time, taking in the stillness, the order, the quiet assurance that had once defined this house. Nothing here had changed. Only the people had. I turned and walked back into the hallway, my steps just as measured as before, my expression calm, composed, the same quiet presence I had carried with me for years, but now with a clarity that made each movement intentional. As I reached the front door, I paused briefly, listening to the distant voices from the dining room, still unaware, still comfortable, still certain that everything was unfolding exactly as they had planned. I opened the door slowly, letting the cold winter air meet me, sharp and clean, a contrast to the warmth I was leaving behind, and I stepped outside without looking back. The snow beneath my shoes crunched softly, the sound steady, grounding, and I closed the door behind me with a quiet finality that did not need to be announced. There were no raised voices, no confrontation, no explanation offered or required. Just a simple departure, timed precisely, carried out without resistance. And as I walked down the path, the weight of the documents resting securely in my purse, I understood something with complete certainty. They had asked me to step away from the table. They had assumed I would leave with nothing. They had believed that control had already shifted into their hands. But what they did not realize, not yet, was that control had never actually left mine. Not until I decided it would. And now, for the first time in a very long time, that decision belonged entirely to me. I did not rush once I reached the end of the driveway, because leaving in a hurry would have suggested panic, and there was nothing uncertain about what I had just done, nothing impulsive about the choice to walk away at that exact moment. So I continued forward at a steady pace, my breath visible in the cold air, the quiet of the street wrapping around me in a way that felt almost unfamiliar after the noise I had just left behind. The neighborhood looked the same as it always had on Christmas morning, lights still glowing softly on front porches, wreaths hanging neatly on doors, a few cars dusted with snow parked along the curb, everything appearing peaceful, almost untouched by the kinds of conversations that changed the course of a family. I reached my car and paused for a second, resting my hand against the door handle, not because I was hesitating, but because I wanted to feel that moment completely, the stillness, the clarity, the absence of confusion that had followed me outside. Then I opened the door and slid into the driver's seat, closing it behind me with a quiet click that sounded louder than expected in the silence. Inside, the air was cold, the leather stiff beneath my hands, and I placed my purse carefully on the passenger seat, my fingers lingering for just a second over the place where the documents rested, not out of doubt, but out of confirmation. Everything was exactly where it needed to be. I started the engine and let it idle, the soft hum filling the space. And for a moment, I simply sat there, looking straight ahead at the empty street, letting the reality of what had just happened settle into something steady and usable. I did not check my phone. I did not look back at the house. There was nothing there that required my attention anymore. After a few seconds, I shifted the car into gear and pulled away from the curb slowly, the tires crunching over the thin layer of snow, and I drove without urgency, without any clear destination at first, just moving forward, allowing the distance between myself and that house to grow naturally. As I turned onto the main road, the quiet of the neighborhood gave way to a different kind of stillness, the kind that comes from early morning traffic, sparse and unhurried. And I found myself thinking not about what I had left behind, but about what had been revealed to me in the process. It is one thing to suspect that you are no longer central to the life you helped build, but it is something entirely different to see the structure of that exclusion laid out so clearly, so deliberately, that there is no room left for misunderstanding. The place card that did not exist. The conversation that continued without me. The envelope that was not given. Each detail small on its own, but together forming something undeniable. I drove for several minutes before realizing exactly where I was headed, the route familiar enough that my hands had followed it without conscious thought. And when I pulled into the parking lot, it felt less like a decision and more like a continuation of something that had already begun long before this morning. The building stood quiet, its windows reflecting the pale winter light, the sign near the entrance simple and professional, unchanged from the last time I had been there. I turned off the engine and sat for a moment longer, my gaze fixed on the door ahead, and I felt that same calm settle in again, deeper this time, more certain. I reached for my purse and stepped out of the car, the cold air sharper now, biting slightly at my cheeks, but it did not distract me. It only made everything feel more defined. Inside, the lobby was nearly empty, a single receptionist seated behind the desk, looking up briefly as I entered, offering a polite nod that required nothing in return, and I returned it with the same quiet composure I had carried all morning. I did not need to explain why I was there. I did not need to rehearse anything. I already knew what needed to be done. As I approached the desk, I could feel the steady rhythm of my own breathing, controlled, even, and I spoke clearly, giving my name, requesting exactly what I needed without hesitation, without elaboration. The receptionist recognized it immediately, the familiarity of my situation evident in the way she responded, efficient, professional, and within moments I was directed to a small office down the hall. The room was simple, orderly, a desk, 2 chairs, a lamp casting a soft, steady light across the surface, and I took a seat without waiting to be invited, placing my purse on the desk in front of me. When the attorney entered, he paused for just a fraction of a second, recognition crossing his face, and then he greeted me in a tone that balanced professionalism with quiet understanding. We had met before, not recently, but often enough that he did not need an explanation for my presence. I opened my purse and removed the documents carefully, placing them on the desk one by one, aligning them neatly, and I met his eyes with a calm that came from certainty, not from emotion. There was no need for dramatic statements, no need for raised voices or accusations. Everything that mattered was already in those pages. And as he began to review them, his expression shifting subtly from routine to attentive, I sat back slightly in my chair and allowed myself a single, quiet realization. For the first time since that morning began, I was no longer reacting to what had been done to me. I was deciding what would happen next. I watched him read without interrupting, because silence, when used correctly, can guide a conversation more effectively than any argument ever could. And the attorney moved through each page carefully, his eyes scanning line by line, his posture shifting slightly as the weight of what he was seeing began to settle in. There was no confusion in his expression, only a growing attentiveness, the kind that comes when details do not align with assumptions. And when he finally looked up at me, it was not with surprise, but with a measured clarity that told me he understood exactly what had changed. He asked a few questions, precise and deliberate, not to challenge me, but to confirm that my intentions matched the structure of the documents. And I answered each one calmly, without hesitation, because I had already considered every angle before walking into that room. There was no uncertainty left in me. He nodded once, then again, and reached for a pen, making small notes in the margins, adjusting language where necessary, reinforcing certain clauses that had once seemed like formalities but now carried a different kind of importance. Time passed quietly, marked only by the soft movement of paper and the occasional sound of his pen against the page, and I found myself observing the process with a sense of detachment, as if I were watching something that had been set in motion long before I recognized it. My husband had believed in preparation, in safeguarding what mattered before it ever became vulnerable, and as I sat there, I could almost hear his voice explaining each decision, each safeguard, each contingency that had been put in place not out of distrust, but out of understanding. People change, circumstances shift, and what feels secure in one moment can become uncertain in the next if it is not actively maintained. When the attorney finished reviewing the final page, he placed the documents neatly in front of me and outlined the adjustments he recommended, his tone steady, professional, but with an undercurrent of something else, something that suggested he had seen situations like this before, situations where clarity arrives too late for some, but not for others. I listened carefully, considering each suggestion, not because I doubted my decision, but because refinement matters when the outcome depends on precision. We discussed the structure of the trust, the control of the accounts, the authority over the property, and with each adjustment, the framework became stronger, less flexible, less open to interpretation, exactly as it needed to be. When it was time to sign, I did so without ceremony, my hand steady, my name written clearly, deliberately, not as an act of defiance, but as an acknowledgement of ownership, of responsibility, of control. He countersigned where required, then gathered the papers, organizing them into a finalized set, sealing what had once been assumed into something explicit, something enforceable. He explained the next steps briefly, what would be filed, what would be updated, what would remain unchanged unless I chose otherwise, and I nodded, absorbing each detail without needing to ask further questions. Everything was clear. Everything was aligned. When the process was complete, he slid a copy of the documents toward me, and I placed them carefully back into my purse, ensuring they were secure, not out of caution, but out of habit, because some things, once recognized as important, are handled with care automatically. I stood then, smoothing my coat slightly, and he rose as well, offering a polite nod that carried a quiet respect, not just for the decision I had made, but for the manner in which I had made it. There had been no urgency, no visible emotion, no indication of conflict beyond the documents themselves, and that was what made it effective. I thanked him briefly, not out of obligation, but out of acknowledgement, and I walked out of the office with the same steady pace I had maintained all morning. The hallway felt quieter now, the building still nearly empty, and as I stepped outside, the cold air met me again, sharp and clear, but it no longer felt like a contrast. It felt appropriate. I walked back to my car, the snow crunching softly beneath my feet, and I allowed myself a single moment of reflection before opening the door, not on what had been lost, but on what had been secured. The difference mattered. I sat behind the wheel once more, placing my purse on the seat beside me, and this time, when I rested my hand over it, there was no question in my mind about what it contained or what it represented. It was not just paper. It was certainty. It was structure. It was the quiet restoration of something that had nearly been taken without acknowledgement. I started the engine again, the familiar hum returning, and I glanced briefly at the clock on the dashboard, noting the time, not because I was in a hurry, but because I understood that somewhere else, in a house filled with holiday decorations and unfinished conversations, the absence of my presence might just be starting to register. And when it did, there would be questions. There would be assumptions. There would be a search for explanations that no longer belonged to me. I shifted the car into gear and pulled out of the parking lot, my movements as calm as they had been all day, because whatever happened next would not be decided by their expectations. It would be shaped by the choices I had already made, quietly, carefully, and without asking for permission. I did not drive far at first, not because I lacked direction, but because I understood that distance is not always measured in miles. Sometimes it is measured in decisions, in the quiet moments where something shifts permanently without needing to be announced. And as I moved through the light traffic, the streets slowly becoming more active as the morning carried on, I could feel that shift settling into place with a kind of finality that did not require confirmation from anyone else. The radio remained off, the car filled only with the steady sound of the engine and the faint hum of the heater working against the cold, and I found that silence suited me, because there was nothing left to distract from the clarity I had reached. After several turns, I found myself pulling into a small coffee shop I had not visited in quite some time, a place I used to stop by years ago when the days felt fuller, when routines still held meaning beyond obligation. I parked near the window and sat for a moment, looking at the reflection of the street in the glass, people moving in and out, carrying cups, exchanging greetings, small, ordinary interactions that carried a sense of ease I had not felt inside that house earlier. When I stepped inside, the warmth met me immediately, along with the soft murmur of conversation and the scent of fresh coffee, and I ordered something simple, something familiar, not because I needed it, but because routine, even a small one, can help anchor a moment that might otherwise feel too large to process all at once. I took my cup and chose a seat near the corner, away from the center, not out of habit this time, but out of preference, because there is a difference between being placed at the edge and choosing it for yourself. I sat down slowly and rested my hands around the cup, feeling the warmth seep into my fingers, grounding me in a way that was both physical and quieting. Around me, conversations continued, people laughing softly, exchanging stories about their plans, their families, their day, and I realized how different it felt to be in a space where no one expected anything from me, where no one had already decided my role before I arrived. I reached into my purse briefly, not to check the documents again, but simply to acknowledge their presence, the weight of them a quiet reassurance that what I had done was not imagined, not temporary, but real and effective. For a moment, I allowed myself to think back, not to the morning itself, but to the years leading up to it, the small adjustments I had made without question, the invitations that became less frequent, the conversations that grew shorter, the way decisions were presented to me as conclusions rather than discussions. It had happened gradually, so gradually that I had convinced myself it was natural, that this was simply how families evolve, how roles shift over time. But sitting there now, removed from that environment, I could see the pattern more clearly, not as a series of isolated moments, but as a steady narrowing of space, a quiet repositioning that had placed me further and further from the center until I was no longer part of it at all. I took a slow sip of coffee and set the cup down carefully, my movements unhurried, because there was no longer any need to rush toward understanding. I already had it. What mattered now was what I would do with it. I glanced briefly at the phone resting in my purse, knowing that at some point it would ring, that messages would appear, that questions would be asked, and I considered what those questions might sound like. Where did you go? Why did you leave? Are you all right? Each one carrying an assumption that I had been the one removed, the one who had stepped away without reason, without explanation. But the truth was simpler than that, and far more precise. I had not been removed. I had stepped out. There is a difference, and it changes everything. I let that thought settle in, not as something I needed to prove, but as something I understood completely. Time passed without me noticing exactly how much. The light outside shifting slightly, the flow of people changing as the morning moved forward, and I remained where I was, not out of indecision, but because there was value in allowing a moment to fully take shape before moving on from it. Eventually, I reached for my purse again, this time taking out my phone, not to check for missed calls, but to consider what needed to be done next, because decisions, once made, require follow-through, and I had no intention of leaving anything incomplete. I scrolled through my contacts slowly, deliberately, stopping when I reached the number I was looking for, someone I trusted, someone who understood both the practical and the personal sides of what had just taken place, and I paused for just a second before pressing the call button, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the significance of the next step. The phone rang once, twice, and then a familiar voice answered, calm, steady, and I spoke clearly, outlining what had changed, what had been done, and what needed to be ensured moving forward. There were no raised voices, no dramatic explanations, only facts, structured and precise, because that is what holds weight when everything else begins to shift. When the call ended, I placed the phone back into my purse and sat for a moment longer, letting the final piece of the morning settle into place. Nothing about what I had done required approval. Nothing about what came next depended on their understanding. And as I finished the last sip of my coffee and stood to leave, I realized that for the first time in a very long time, I was not adjusting to someone else's decisions. I was moving forward with my own. I stepped back out into the cold air with a steadiness that felt earned rather than forced, the kind of calm that comes after a decision has already been carried through to completion, not just planned. And as I walked toward my car again, I noticed that the sky had shifted. Slightly, the pale winter light now sharper, clearer, as if the day itself had moved forward without waiting for anyone to catch up. I slid into the driver's seat and placed my purse beside me once more, my hand resting lightly on it for a brief moment, not out of habit this time, but as a quiet acknowledgement of everything it now represented, not just documents, but control, structure, and the careful protection of something that had nearly been taken without resistance. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, this time with a clearer direction in mind, because uncertainty had no place in what came next. The roads were busier now, families heading to gatherings, children in the back seats holding wrapped boxes, people moving through the day with expectations of warmth and connection, and I drove through it all without feeling separate from it, but no longer dependent on it either. After a short drive, I turned into a different part of town, one that felt familiar in a quieter way, less crowded, more deliberate, and I parked in front of a small building that had once been part of my routine long before everything shifted around me. I stepped inside and was greeted by a sense of order that felt reassuring, the kind of place where things were handled carefully, where details mattered, where decisions were recorded, not assumed. The receptionist recognized me after a moment, offering a polite smile that carried no curiosity, only professionalism, and I returned it with the same calm presence I had carried throughout the morning. I did not need to explain why I was there in detail. I simply stated what needed to be done, clearly, directly, and within minutes I was seated across from a representative who listened attentively as I outlined the necessary updates, the changes that had already been set in motion, and the steps required to ensure they would be reflected properly moving forward. There were forms, signatures, confirmations, each one handled with precision, each one reinforcing the structure I had already secured earlier. There was no resistance, no complication, only process, and I moved through it steadily, answering questions when needed, clarifying where necessary, ensuring that nothing was left open to interpretation. When everything was complete, I was given confirmation, not in words alone, but in documentation, in records that would stand regardless of conversation or assumption elsewhere. I placed those confirmations into my purse alongside everything else, closing it carefully, knowing that what I carried now was not just proof of action, but protection against anything that might follow. As I stood to leave, I felt a quiet sense of alignment settle in, not relief, not satisfaction in the dramatic sense, but something more grounded, more enduring, the understanding that I had done exactly what needed to be done without delay, without hesitation, without asking for permission from anyone who had already shown they did not intend to include me in their decisions. Outside, the air felt less sharp than before, or perhaps I had simply adjusted to it, and as I walked back to my car, I allowed myself a brief glance at the street, at the people moving through their own routines, their own expectations, and I realized that what had changed for me was not the world around me, but the position I held within it. I was no longer waiting to be acknowledged, no longer adjusting myself to fit into a space that had been quietly taken away. I was defining my own place again, not through confrontation, but through action that required no explanation to be effective. I got into the car and sat for a moment before starting the engine, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, my posture relaxed, composed, and I thought briefly about the house I had left behind, not with regret, not with longing, but with clarity. That house had been part of my life, a significant part, but it was not the entirety of it, and more importantly, it was no longer the center of my decisions. Somewhere inside it, conversations were likely unfolding now, questions being asked, assumptions forming, perhaps even concern beginning to surface, but none of that altered what had already been secured. I started the engine and pulled away once more, the movement smooth, unhurried, and as I merged back into the flow of the day, I understood something with complete certainty. They had believed that control could be shifted quietly, that decisions could be made without my awareness, that I would accept whatever position was left for me. But control is not something that disappears without action. It is something that must be handed over or taken back. And I had made sure, quietly, precisely, that it remained exactly where it belonged. I did not return home that day, not immediately, because some distances need time to settle before they can be understood, and as I continued driving, the city gradually unfolding around me in its usual rhythm, I realized that what I had stepped away from was not just a house or a single moment at a table, but an entire version of myself that had been quietly shrinking for years without my full awareness. The phone in my purse began to vibrate at some point, a soft, persistent reminder that somewhere behind me, the absence I left had finally been noticed, but I did not reach for it right away, not out of avoidance, but because I already understood what those calls would carry. Questions without real curiosity. Concern shaped more by inconvenience than care. Words that would try to pull me back into a role I had already stepped out of. When I eventually did glance at the screen, I saw Daniel's name repeated more than once, followed by a message, brief and direct, asking where I had gone, asking if everything was all right. And for a moment, I studied those words with a kind of calm distance, recognizing how little they reflected the truth of what had actually happened. Everything was all right. More than all right. For the first time in a long time, everything was exactly as it needed to be. I set the phone back down without responding, not out of spite, not out of punishment, but because there was no urgency in explaining something that had already been made clear through action. I turned onto a quieter road, one lined with tall trees now bare for the winter, their branches reaching upward against the pale sky, and I slowed slightly, allowing the stillness of that stretch to settle around me, because there was something fitting about ending the day not with noise, but with quiet understanding. I thought about the years behind me, the routines I had maintained, the compromises I had accepted, the way I had measured my place in the family by how much I could give, how little I required in return, and I realized that somewhere along the way, that balance had shifted without my noticing. Giving had become expected, presence had become optional, and eventually, I had become invisible in a space I once defined. But invisibility only holds power when it is accepted. The moment it is recognized, it loses its control. I pulled the car over briefly near a small overlook, the kind of place that offered a clear view of the town below, quiet, open, unchanged by the details of any one household, and I turned off the engine, letting the silence return fully. For a few seconds, I simply sat there, my hands resting loosely in my lap, my posture relaxed, my breathing even, and I allowed the weight of the day to settle into something stable, something complete. There was no lingering confusion, no unresolved question, no sense of something left undone. Everything that needed to happen had already taken place. The documents were secured. The decisions were finalized. The structure that protected what I had built was no longer assumed. It was defined. I reached for my purse once more, not to check anything, but to acknowledge its presence, and I understood that what I had taken with me that morning was never just paper. It was control. It was clarity. It was the quiet refusal to be repositioned without consent. After a moment, I started the engine again and turned back toward the road, the path ahead clear, not because it had been mapped out in detail, but because it no longer depended on anyone else's expectations. As I drove, the phone vibrated once more, another call, another message, but I let it remain unanswered, Because explanations belong to those who are willing to listen before decisions are made, not after they have already been carried out. By the time I reached the edge of town, the light had begun to soften, the afternoon settling into a calm that felt steady rather than fleeting, and I realized that what had begun as a moment of quiet humiliation had transformed into something entirely different, something deliberate, something controlled. They had asked me to step aside. They had believed I would leave quietly, with nothing, without question, and I had left quietly. That part was true, but I had not left empty-handed. I had left with everything that mattered, everything that defined ownership, everything that ensured that no decision about my life would be made without me again. And as the road stretched out ahead, open and certain, I understood one final thing with complete clarity. They had thought they were deciding my place at the table. What they had actually done was remind me that I no longer needed a seat there at all.